Hello, care leaders. My guest today is Matthew Bond, and today we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of sponsorship. For those of you who don't know Matt, he's the chief executive of Borderless, which is a dynamic, rapid growth tech company founded in 2022. And Borderless combines both technology and human expertise to provide compliance, visa processing, sponsor license assistance, and recruitment services to the care sector. Before founding Borderless, Matt worked in the tech industry in both California and London. And an interesting fact about Matt is the fact that he's the archetypal entrepreneur, having established his first business at university in Oxford, where he set up both printing and clothing companies. For complete transparency, I should let you know that I am an investor in Borderless and that I made that investment because I really believe in what Borderless and the team are trying to achieve. Today, you'll learn an awful lot more about sponsorship and why it should be a part of your hiring strategy. Interesting things that you can expect to learn from this episode include how birth rates in the UK are intrinsically linked to care sector recruitment, why the world has moved on from sponsorship being unnecessarily expensive and time consuming, the implications of not being compliant with a Home Office and how to avoid doing so, and how immigration and migration will likely evolve under the new Labour government. My name is Simon Parker, and this is the Care Leaders Network podcast. On that note, please welcome Matt Bond. So Matt, tell me, why is it important that we talk about sponsorship?
Yeah, so sponsorship's a really important topic because it really relates a lot to the UK and overall migration. If you think about the big picture and the macro situation we have in the UK, essentially there is a shortage of people in the UK, and really due to population trends, due to the fact that we're only having 1.4, 1.5 children per family, we're on a bit of a population crash course. And so therefore what we need is migration into the UK. It's all driven by that underlying workforce dynamic. And it's been a tricky topic for the UK to get right ultimately. The UK has had really aggressive targets around migration, keeping it down to try and keep it down to 100,000. And we saw record numbers of migration, but not necessarily the right kind of migration. And so if we're talking about the needs of individual care providers, it's really driven by that need for staff, that need to make sure your workforce is future-proof. And ultimately, if you don't have migration, then the UK is not going to get enough people in the workforce, and it's not going to make for a conducive service environment for care providers. And so it's really important for care providers to think about sponsorship because essentially, if you don't have a sponsor license, if you're not able to sponsor individuals from abroad and also those individuals in the UK who need sponsorship, then you are basically restricting yourself from hiring. You're making hiring more difficult than it needs to be. And so we're really, really big believers in opening borders and making sure that care companies, care providers and individuals have those opportunities. So sponsorship is a really, really important part of your overall hiring strategy.
One of the things that I don't think most people realise is the fact that the birth rate is 1.4 children versus I think it was 2.2 maybe 20 or 30 years ago or something like that, which doesn't sound like a lot, but as a percentage rate of the population is an astonishing percent. And the implications from a workforce perspective, from an economic perspective, it's a global issue. It's absolutely huge.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's. That's driven by so many things, right? And you're right. Firstly, to call it out as a global issue, particularly in certain parts of the world. That number, and if you just look at the charts, look at the trends in Europe, in North America, those numbers have been falling. 20, 30 years ago, you're right. We were in a position where most countries were able to maintain their populations with that 1.2, 2.1, 2.2 replacement population rate, and that's really fallen over the last 20, 30 years. It's due to a really large number of factors, but ultimately, like, we're having fewer children later, and that has all sorts of knock-on implications for every sector in the UK. And that workforce dynamic is changing as well. The rise of technology is shifting how people work, and some sectors change differently in response to that. And the care sector is one of those sectors that it's hard, and ultimately no one really wants to have individuals, you don't want to be cared for by technology as an enabler in this business, but it's a very human business, right? And we're always going to need people, empathetic, caring people to look after us at any stage in our life. And it's something which is very deeply linked to population trends. So it is a concerning thing, and there've been many, many topics and people that have raised this issue, and it's not something that you can change overnight, right? These are long-standing, multi-decade policies that governments need to encourage and incentivize. And you can look at many countries around the world where different, very strong, very rigid policies have been in place, and that's having all sorts of implications decades later. So, what can we do about it right now? I think it's all about making sure that there is that ability for people in the workforce to move, to transact, to translate borders and find those opportunities, because those birth rates in countries are very different in the UK to other parts of the world.
I definitely want to ask you some questions about UK policy, obviously with the new government coming in. I'll pick up on that one in a little bit. Where do you see the biggest misconceptions around sponsorship? Because it seems to be an ever-changing landscape. There's obviously quite a lot that comes to it. I think the Home Office, not the easiest organisation to work with, etc. There's just quite a lot of stuff to get in there. So break those points down for me around the misconceptions.
Yeah, I think firstly, it's a topic that relates, when you're talking about migration, when you're talking about immigration, it always ranks as a top 3 issue for voters, right? So everyone's got often quite a strong opinion about immigration and migration. I'm not going to go into the details of all of that here and now, but I think related to that, there's a lot of misconceptions that emerge about sponsorship and what it is, what it isn't. And so we hear a lot of different things, but I primarily break them down into 3 different components. So the first is around the cost of sponsorship. Because it's a complicated process, because there's lots of things involved in it, and there's third-party fees, there's government fees, it can often sound quite overwhelming. And historically, we've had numbers that, it's £5,000, £10,000 to sponsor individuals. When you actually start breaking it down and thinking, okay, what are the actual costs involved? It's orders of magnitude lower than that. And so, really, if you're a care provider, there is only a set of minimal government fees that you need to pay. And to be honest, without going into all the details here, it actually does. If you're even up to a medium-sized care provider, it's roughly about 20p per hour to sponsor an individual. And so when you contrast that to what care companies have been doing before, using agencies, all of the costs associated with high industry turnover, I think the last report I saw was 36% industry turnover in the care sector overall. Think about all of that cost of onboarding, cost of training, cost of rehiring. That is really the cost of sponsorship. Now, there are other costs involved and other things that you might want to support individuals with, but those are things that is up to any individual care provider, and they're better and worse things to do that. So I do think overall there's a lot of misconception around how expensive the process is. Really, there's a one-off cost to get a sponsor license, and there's a one-off cost each time you sponsor a person. And I think the way it's been thrown around has often been quite off-putting for care providers. And that's due in part to the complexity of some of the fees, the different things involved here. The second thing we found is that it is a complicated process, right? But there's an understanding. I think when people first start exploring sponsorship, there are so many terms, there is so much terminology, unhelpful terminology that the Home Office use to describe things, that it becomes very, very difficult to crack the egg and understand what all these things mean. And so what we've found is that is a very off-putting situation for care providers, and it's ultimately quite discouraging, when in fact sponsorship is actually a really, really positive endeavor. And so it's really important that you take the time to understand the process and the system, at a high level first, but also just try and recognize the benefits of sponsorship in addition to the challenges and some of the other considerations of sponsorship. Yes, it's a complicated thing, but once you start understanding the process, it will start to fall into place. And so those are some of the misconceptions that I hear a lot. It's very expensive. It's very complicated. I think the final thing we often see is that, especially when we're talking about migration and people from other countries, there's a lot of misconceptions about what that means for you as an employer, for that individual coming in, and also the impact of that individual on your workforce. And a lot of the initial objections I hear around, oh, how's this going to work with my service users? How's this going to work with my existing staff? How is that cultural integration going to happen? And we hear this a lot, but then I hear, funnily enough, 2, 3 months later, that same care provider who's gone down that journey say, wow, that was never a problem. Like that actually worked really, really well. And they see huge benefits to their organization from that cultural diversity. So I think I think with any complicated, expensive, or seemingly expensive process, there's an opportunity to get a lot of misconceptions, and it really is important to take the time to break those things down, because there are really some great benefits to sponsorship as well.
So we've got navigating, there's the cost misconception, there's the navigating the home office misconception, and then there's the
Yep.
cultural integration piece as well. Picking up on the last point, if you've got a decent onboarding team and you're investing in your culture and you're doing a half decent job of looking after people, of the whole team, and yeah, be mindful of the fact that you have people coming from different countries. Obviously, it's something that you have to look at. You can't just leave it up, kind of gung ho, and just hope for the best. It requires a certain amount of time and investment. But diversity and inclusion is like kind of a massive thing anyway. It doesn't matter whether that's somebody that's come from the UK or somebody that's come from abroad. One would like to think that that's kind of part of the modus operandi for care providers, and that would be almost in addition to what they should already be doing in that realm as well, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. And I think you're right. And I think that's why the care sector has, by and large, like embraced sponsorship very well. It's through that open attitude to staff, to individuals. I think the difference that sort of emerged have been to be honest, more of the impact on the service users and how it's going to go down for them. And is that going to be something which makes it more difficult for them to win contracts and build their business? And I think it's not an objection we've heard. I think it was something which we heard increasing more and more in the past. We're hearing it less and less these days because sponsorship has become more prevalent across the care sector. And frankly, there are a lot more people in the UK workforce. The mix of people has become increasingly diverse. And so I just think a lot of care providers have got more exposed to that now. And I think you're right to call out that there's already diversity in the workforce already. So we're big believers in embracing that diversity, and I think the vast majority of the industry is as well.
On the point around the government, who would have thought that a government division would be bureaucratic and difficult to work with?
Surely not.
What a shock horror. Talk to me just a little bit around the whole navigating the home office set of circumstances, because I think that deserves maybe a little bit more explanation, because it is tough. I've had dealings. I know it's a different organisation, but I've had dealings with the HMRC recently where I'm just like, none of this makes any sense. Like, I'm not being communicated with. Everything's just way more complex than it has to be. And I understand the fact that they're completely overburdened and stuff like that, but it makes it very, very frustrating. And I'm just drawing a comparison between the two and just expecting that they're probably not dissimilar in lots of different ways. Just elaborate on that point for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've already identified a few of those things there, but essentially, it's like many parts of government. They're trying to do the right thing in terms of find the balance. And actually, let's just analyze that balance for a second there, because there is a bit of a tension here. So on one hand, you've got that workforce. You've got that workforce challenge. You've got a relentlessly increasing population. The proportion of people over 80 is going to treble over the next 10 years. So you've got this demand for care that's going up 6-7% every year. And that's really, really correlated to the number of people in the sector, right? So you've got care providers who know they're going to need to continue to hire staff to continue to build their businesses. On the flip side of that, you've got a government targets around migration, the fact that 745,000, the number we saw at the end of last year, is a big number relative to the official government target of 100,000, right? And so the UK government and the Home Office in particular is trying to figure out a way to walk that tightrope of how do I make sure we solve problems for individual businesses, but how do we also maintain and manage an explicit target around migration? Now, I think you could argue that there's a lot of whether that framework is even right to try and target an explicit amount of migration, whether changing visa policies and fees and dependent bans is ultimately the wrong levers to be pulling to hit that target. But ultimately, that's the sort of the tightrope that the Home Office in particular needs to walk, right? You've got ministers with targets, with explicit pressure from voters who rank immigration as a really, really important issue, versus the needs of the individual care providers and companies in the UK. And so the Home Office, therefore, has to set up a system which has the appropriate checks and balances, but doesn't make it impossible, but doesn't make it easy either. And so with that, as you allude to, you make a system which is you're not incentivized to improve the system to make it that much cleaner and simpler. It's I believe by nature, by design, it's useful to government that these processes are bureaucratic and they're complicated. And I think that's one big piece of it. And I think the second piece is, frankly, like public finances and services, the public finances are not in a good state, and therefore the amount of budget that these organisations get is limited. And that means, what does that mean? All of the individual caseworkers at the Home Office, resources are stretched, and so it means that response times are long. Language is unclear. It's very difficult to speak to people at these organisations, and so you do often feel like you're banging your head against the wall when you're trying to interact with these organisations. The final other thing that's obviously happened is, particularly for the Home Office, and when we're talking immigration and migration, the focus has really gone onto care companies because of the lack of support and lack of resources and appropriate regulatory oversight under sponsorship. That all changed with that record net migration number. And so now the focus of the Home Office is really on care companies. And this is why we see so much confusion, so much tension, I think, that exists between the Home Office and care providers at the moment.
I wouldn't want that job, as in from a governmental perspective. There's so many different perspectives as well around migration. Ultimately, from kind of a population perspective, I don't think it would be possible for them to get it right, and it's such an incredibly contentious, emotive issue as well. I feel like that one's above my pay grade. It's
not an easy question, right? It's not easy to get the right balance of migration into the UK, and everyone has an opinion on this. So very difficult to balance.
And then just coming back to the first point that you highlighted, cost. One of the things that really shook me to the core when I spoke to one of my old colleagues about this was the fact that people in other countries were getting charged inordinate amounts of money. As were the care providers in some cases as well, which is basically, extortion. Kind of has modern slavery kind of connections, all of that type of stuff. And I was completely oblivious to it at this point. I wasn't surprised, but it really, really sickened me the fact that was even a thing. Now, it sounds like the Home Office has worked pretty hard to try and tighten up this within the constraints that they have. But it sounds like, so on one side, you've got the kind of illegitimate bad players who are ultimately just conducting themselves really, really poorly. And then on the flip side of things, you've got the kind of the people who are, let's say, profiteering from the set of circumstances over and above what's kind of reasonable and decent in that scenario. And I guess there's probably a bit of grey area in between those two. It just feels very ick, the whole set of circumstances. Yep. So talk to me about what the landscape has looked like in that respect from a cost perspective, because obviously you've got your basic administration costs, but there have been some people who, quite frankly, have been really taking the piss on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of related to that complicated process, that lack of oversight. But as you say, exactly that. There've been an opportunity. Unscrupulous parties have taken an opportunity to jump into this complicated, opaque, lack of oversight system, and basically charge people coming into the UK anything from 5 to 10 to 15 to £20,000 to come here. And in some cases, it's been completely fraudulent. That company that they were allegedly going to come and work for never existed. That person who charged them the money ran off. In other cases, it's just extortionate levels of fees. And yes, they do get to the UK, but the job's not great or not what was promised. And as you say, it really relates a lot to the modern slavery issue. And these issues are all really interconnected. The fact that there have been so many middlemen in this process historically has just led to it's very easy for firstly not really to know. it's difficult to connect the ends together here, right? You've got a care provider here in the UK looking for staff, looking to sponsor individuals, and you've got individuals abroad. That process has never been very easy for those individuals to connect, and so that's why we've had often local recruiters in the UK, individuals who are abroad who are working with local recruiters, and that's where these issues have come from. The fact that there's been that opportunity and there's been that inability of the care providers ultimately know whether those candidates be charged recruitment fees. So we've seen this process happen a lot. We don't think it's an acceptable position for the UK to be even not indirectly, but like having created the circumstances for this to happen. And so a big part of the solution here is increased transparency, the right and appropriate regulatory framework to make this system work better. But it is a very nefarious practice. It's very hard to stamp down on, and ultimately it has been a system which government has created, which has enabled this to happen, and still happens. Right? There's a lot of modern slavery and exploitation that goes on, even in the UK, for sponsored workers. It's tricky when you're sponsoring an individual for that individual often to find new employment. There's the potential for that relationship to become too much of too close, too much power ultimately sits in the hands with the sponsor. And that's why we still hear stories of unfair employment contracts, charging money for references, and it's a lot of the time educating individuals about their rights, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and often in those cases, we're able to step in and help those situations. But it's an area that's had a lot of historic exploitation. We have started to see it go down, and it is thanks to better oversight from the government. But it's still there, and it's something I think everyone in society, frankly, needs to be aware of and figure out a way to escalate, to report, and to improve.
Sponsorship has evolved quite a lot over the last few years. Talk to me about how the landscape has evolved, because there's been quite a few big changes.
Yep. Yeah, so sponsorship's always been available to UK companies. People have been coming to the UK for centuries and decades, but it's only really been put on the map for care providers in the last 2.5 years. This is basically when, back in February 2022, care workers, senior care workers, and a few other roles became eligible for something called the Health and Care Worker Visa. And this was basically a special visa that the government introduced for those individuals because of, as emerging from COVID times, recruitment was that difficult. It was still a very, very pressing problem for companies. And so what happened back then was that the Migration Advisory Committee in 2021 had made recommendations to the government for additional support it could provide the care sector as it related to migration into the care sector. And so there were lots of recommendations that were made. The government actually just picked one of them. They said they were going to make care workers eligible for the Health Care Worker Visa. And this basically led to a real surge in applications. I don't think the Home Office were quite prepared for the number of care companies that jumped into this, the number of sponsor license applications which were made. And we just saw record numbers. I think something like 200,000 people in the care sector came in the first 18 months alone. And so what you can imagine happening there with understaffed Home Office was basically everything was getting approved. Sponsor licenses were approved, COS, many companies, small companies could get 100, 200 COS. And this kind of relates to some of the issues that we were talking about before in terms of lack of oversight, lack of regulation and transparency, and all of this candidate exploitation as well. The wake-up call was really last year, a record net migration number in November last year of 745,000, tons of political pressure and heat to change the system. And so what happened? We basically saw defined COS, so overseas recruitment, basically go on freeze, on ice overnight. It was near on impossible for care companies to bring in people from abroad. And that was just a policy decision that the government had made. And then the second thing we saw happen was just a really, really big focus on bureaucracy, on regulation, and ultimately trying to make up for the lack of regulatory environment before. So what did that mean for care providers? Lots more sponsor license suspensions and revocations, many audits and inspections. And so the focus has shifted really, particularly in the last 9 months, onto these kind of topics. And therefore, the biggest thing we see that care providers struggle with right now is all about Home Office compliance and what you need to do to get compliant there. Because ultimately, it sounds like a simple thing, but when you start to dig down into the details, compliance is a really, really big issue, and it's connected to many different parts of your business. So the Home Office really does still have care companies in its sights. It thinks that a way to keep migration down is to make sure that migration stay, that those care companies are make it harder for those care companies to sponsor those staff and find those add bureaucracy to the process to make it harder, essentially.
Does well, talk to me more about the compliance thing, because that's within of itself that's a pretty big issue.
Yeah, I think the real risk that we've seen is that the Home Office has become very, very willing to in the first instance, issue fines, and these fines are can be really quite significant. So you're allowed to charge. The Home Office is able to charge fines of up to £45,000 for the first offence, and then £60,000 for every single compliance infraction across your business. That's per incident, per worker. So I've actually seen care companies lumped with 3 or 4 fines off the bat. And that's obviously, as you can imagine, those kind of numbers are really, really penal for your business. That's a financial cost to your business. The second thing is the Home Office has complete authority and complete power to suspend or revoke your sponsor license. And if you are sponsoring a certain percent of your workforce, 5, 10, 20, 30% of your workforce, essentially, if you lose your sponsor license, you can no longer employ those employees overnight. And that has obviously a devastating and could have a devastating impact on your business. So the compliance aspect is really, really, really very huge, and it's something and muscles the Home Office has become much more willing to flex. In the whole of 2020, up until around December last year, there were a tiny fraction of companies that had ever had any, a handful of companies that were getting sponsor license revoked. And then we saw basically something between a 10 to 20x increase in sponsor license suspensions. And this was really down to the fact that the Home Office wanted to catch up on some of that lack of regulatory oversight. So Home Office compliance is really just non-negotiable for care companies. It is a must-have, and it must be done correctly. Otherwise, you are significantly at risk of sponsor license suspension and revocation.
I guess the implications of losing, whatever percentage of your workforce is it could be catastrophic for the actual business itself. It's obviously going to have massive implications for the people on the receiving end of the care services in whatever care environment that
we should like. Absolutely, and we should add as well there's the impact on the business, but then there's impact on the service users and also the individuals that company sponsors, right? So all of those sponsored workers now need to find new employment. They're in the UK. It may be no fault of their own that the sponsor license has been revoked, but those individuals now only have around 60 days to find new employment. Otherwise, their legal status, their legal right to be in the UK no longer exists. And so for them, it's a really stark choice. And that's why, it's not just the business, it's also the wider impact of losing the sponsor license on that whole community.
Yeah, definitely. You've got 3 major stakeholders there that ultimately stand to lose quite a significant amount in that scenario. How much, maybe it's difficult to say, but how much do you think of it is down to, I guess, almost like clerical errors, mismanagement of paperwork, because it's just it's because it's so bureaucratic and because there's an awful lot of paperwork involved? How much of it do you think is that, and then how much of it is just more in the realm of just not wanting it to be a problem, so not really thinking about it properly? Do you know what I mean? Because there's people who are trying to be diligent and then just like making mistakes, and then there's people who actually maybe they don't care, which is, one would hope that it's not too many people, but I guess there's people that fall into both of those categories.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the balance has shifted from historically more of the people who didn't care / didn't take the time to understand the system and didn't think it was going to be a problem, to far fewer of those people today with the regulatory environment we have. And so many companies we find scrambling to get the systems and to get the right processes in place to manage Home Office compliance. Even with the best will in the world, that clerical error is still massive. The amount of complexity there is, even just with routine things like assigning certificates of sponsorship. If you think about what goes into those COSs and the number of different immigration-related decisions or experience and understanding you need to fill these things in correctly, it's just very easy to make a mistake. And that has downstream implications for visa processing, for the individuals, for when that person can start with your organization. I'm not saying the Home Office is going to issue a £45,000, £60,000, £30,000 fine if a tiny thing has been made in error, but it all adds up, right? And so the Home Office has access to all of the systems and everything's recorded. So avoiding those clerical errors is really, really paramount. And you don't want to have all of the costly delays associated with trying to fix those errors. It's much better to get that information correct up front. The other thing we find is that you can go on the government website, you can read what compliance is and means and all of that documentation. There's also a huge body of immigration law and expertise and case history which relates to that. And so often we find it's not even a consistent framework. So it's hard to even know what the correct thing to do is. And so when you start digging, when you're trying to understand all the details here, that's when a lot of the issues can emerge. And so ultimately, getting compliant is making sure all of the big things are done, and then all of the sub things under that are really sorted too. And that's where a lot of care companies think they're compliant, and we get lots of people saying, "Hey, I think I'm compliant. Can you guys come and have a look at it?" And when we start to investigate, there are always things that get found, and those are the things that I think you don't want that it's important to address as soon as possible, because those are the things that the Home Office will probably find if they come and do an audit.
And to a large extent, they're not going to care whether it's a clerical error or whether it's willful ignorance or whatever the set of circumstances is. If it's incompliant to the extent that they're not comfortable with, and then ultimately
you will have to make a strong exactly. Yeah, you're going to have they have their process, they have their policies and playbooks and frameworks, and the way they approach audits, the way they handle follow-ups to the audits, all of this stuff. And if they do decide to suspend a license or revoke a license, even, you are going to battle them for, hey, this was a clerical error, hey this, hey that. And that's going to, at minimum, mean that you're spending a lot of your time and energy, and at best 2 to 3 months, trying to get your sponsor license reinstated or that suspension lifted. So it's just much better to be avoiding a situation where they're even going to come over in the first place.
Doesn't sound like a lot of fun. I don't think anyone wants to be on the receiving end of any government body.
The fastest ones I've seen happen in about 3 or 4 hours. The longest ones I've seen happen take multiple days. And they interview you, they interview your staff, depending on the size of the organization. Even small organizations have about 5 to 6 people interviewed. And so bigger organizations, you can imagine, it's just a lot of preparation time and time spent during audits as well.
I was about to ask a question about what the biggest challenges are that providers face. I guess that's a big one. But talk to me about what the other challenges maybe look like in that realm.
Home Office compliance is a really, really, really big one. The second one we see is all around basically battling the Home Office for more certificates of sponsorship, for more COS requests. One of the things that was put in place, because it was seen as a way people were basically contributing to a lot of migration, was around the COS request process. So this is a process, for those of you less familiar, where if you have a sponsor license already and you've used the undefined certificates available to you, you need to go and request more undefined certificates. Or if you're sponsoring someone from abroad, you need to go and request defined certificates for overseas. So basically, every time you want to sponsor someone, if you've used your credits, you need to go and make a request to the government to sponsor one or more people. The government made that process it used to be a process where you would say, hey, I need 3 more certificates, and these are the reasons why. And you'd write a few sentences, and you'd get those approved in a week or 2. That whole process has just morphed into what I would probably only describe as a battle between yourself and the government to build an entire case around why you need these certificates, why you have a genuine need in your business to sponsor staff, why you've exhausted local recruitment opportunities, why the business is growing, why the business has won a new contract. You need to demonstrate so many things to the Home Office before they will give you these certificates of sponsorship. And so it was a policy that was put in place to try and reduce exploitation and the fact that very small companies had a lot of certificates. There were some companies that had license to spoke. One person in head office sponsored 200 people. And that was, when the Home Office investigated, just a ridiculously embarrassing situation for them. But it's been applied, this policy of COS bureaucracy has been applied very heavy-handedly, and the amount of time and effort it's meant for care companies to get these certificates is now this constant friction that you need to have. And so that's something that we expect to continue. We do think the Home Office is starting to learn more about the care providers and how they operate and their business. It's been a real clash of worlds between the Home Office and care providers in the last couple of years. Sponsorship has historically been for a different, frankly, office-based jobs, and that's a different model for many care providers.
We touched upon earlier the position of the government. Let's say, obviously, we've had a changing of guard recently. We now have a Labour government. What's your view or maybe expectation around how things will play out under the new government?
What we've seen really is the Labour being much more willing to maintain and continue Conservative government policies. So we had this real shake-up of the migration system last year, and Labour have said that they're not explicitly expecting that them to reverse any of those policies. So, excuse me. One of the most unfair things that I think happened was the ban on dependents. Care workers, senior care workers, from April of this year were no longer allowed to bring in dependents. Everyone else who was being sponsored was. And the government were looking at the numbers and said, okay, by the numbers, on average, individuals who've been sponsored for care roles are bringing in more dependents than other roles. And so they thought that they could save 10, 15,000 in terms of a net migration number by permitting that. But that's in my opinion a really unfair thing. Unfortunately, Labour haven't said anything about wanting to remove that. So it is, in our opinion, it's going to be a continuation of existing policy. Now, I don't think we're going to see the huge changes that affect the migration system. What we are going to see is a further focus on regulation. Labour have also said they're going to be building up an independent oversight body to investigate cases of exploitation and abuse in the care sector and try to, even more than it has already been, bring it more into the public domain, into the public dialogue, to try to make people wider in society aware of these things, because I think it's still sometimes a bit of a hidden thing that people are not really thinking about all that much. So we're going to see a continued focus on regulation, a continued cleaning up, hopefully, of the system and some of those unsavory things, which we think is a really, really good thing. They've also said that they want to engage with businesses more on migration and immigration, and I think that's a welcome thing. I think it's good that there's a dialogue between companies and government around this. I think historically there hasn't been enough of it. There've just been changes that get introduced, and companies are left scrambling to try to figure out the new system and how to adapt to it. So that's a very welcome change too. But ultimately, Labour do want to keep the numbers down. They don't want to return to those kind of record net migration numbers, and so they're not all that incentivized to tinker with the system. The final thing is that obviously the public finances are not in a great state, and so Labour's hands are tied here. One thing they have said they want to do as well is to try to encourage more back-to-work programs, apprenticeship schemes, and so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Will there be money available to do that? What does that look like? How does that mix of people, which sectors are they going into? Are they entering the care sector, going to other sectors? And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out. But ultimately, when you take a step back and you just run the numbers, even if you had all of the people who are out of the workforce coming into new sectors, you're still ultimately not going to find enough people. There just aren't enough people in the UK and long term to be able to fulfill all these roles.
Yeah, I mean I guess that's the worry, right? So the demand is going up. The workforce, it's certainly not going to keep up with demand. There's obviously kind of internal recruitment programs that we can run as a country for the UK population, but to what extent, and how also as well, how incentivized is the government going to be there to try and support that? The answer to that question.
And I'll just say, I'll add as well. We don't think sponsorship is sort of the answer to workforce strategy for care providers. We think the future of the care sector workforce is hybrid. We think an increasing share of the people in the care sector workforce will require a visa. Either they'll be directly sponsored, or they'll be in the UK on a student visa, graduate visa. They'll potentially be working part-time. And so it's really important to continue to focus on domestic recruitment, native worker recruitment, making sure that you're doing the best things there. Ultimately, we just think that it's important to make sure that you have all of the options available to you when you are building your workforce.
Yeah, I mean, there's never going to be a panacea for this, is there? One might dream of one, but yeah, no, it's not a realistic set of circumstances. Is it? Ultimately, you need to have a really good quality, robust recruitment and retention strategy, because obviously that's a big contributor to the recruitment challenges. And if you haven't got that, ultimately you're going to struggle, and immigration will continue to play a really big part in that. So, talk to me about from a provider perspective. What can people do to make sure that they're set up for success and that they can overcome some of the challenges that we've talked about there? Because there's quite a lot there in this respect. Obviously, it's a key part of the strategy, but if you get it wrong, the implications can be massive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to do is don't rush. Take your time to properly evaluate all of the things that pertain to workforce, recruitment, retention, sponsorship. How does that all play together for you as an individual company? And also, where are you based, right? Where does your organization operate? The dynamics, as I'm sure you're aware, are different in different parts of the UK. So think long and hard about how you want to set up your overall strategy around this kind of thing. I think the second thing to evaluate is sponsorship something that you want to develop a core competency in as a business, or is it better to outsource this and make sure that you can focus and give yourself space and time to focus on other areas of your business? I would argue that this is an important but not core activity to what you do as a care provider. And therefore, it's better placed to leave this to reliable systems and processes where you can just trust and have peace of mind that this is going to all be done correctly. And so the second piece of advice I have is putting in place best-in-class systems, processes to deal with this is really, really important. And there's some great advancements in the kind of systems out there and availability to do that. So that's a really, really important thing. And I think what we often find as well is that people will try and go down this sponsorship journey themselves. And a few months later, we'll be talking to them again because they've really run into a bit of a wall with getting things set up, having a sponsor license rejected, trying to get to talk to someone at the Home Office to try and understand a 5-page response that's been given with a lot of immigration terminology, which just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I do think it's really, really important to just ultimately decide from the beginning how you want to approach sponsorship and how you want to set yourself up well for success. I do think that sponsorship has been really, really transformational, and we've seen many instances of this for the people we work with here and some of our partners today. I think it's really been 3 kind of main areas. The firstly is about this risk factor we've been talking about a lot. How do you make sure that on a continual basis you are well set up for Home Office compliance? Because things change in your organization. The government rules change, things in your organization change, worker circumstances change, and that all needs to be reported back to the Home Office. And so really what you want is, you don't want a one-time audit. You don't want a one-time, okay, I'm good. You need a real-time system to be able to continuously monitor compliance, flag document expiries, let you know when the rules are changing, and make it really, really easy for your organization to essentially eliminate the risks of Home Office audits and inspections. The second thing I think it's really a great benefit of using some of these better ways of doing things is just a significant time reduction. So do you want to spend your time on this immigration and compliance activities, or do you want to reduce them? Do you want to be able to focus on business and growth? And the final thing I think we see is that there are really, really big benefits in terms of cost and cost savings. Using technology to make these processes easier, to better connect to government systems, means that you just don't need to do all of these manual tasks yourself, and you don't need to rely on more traditional solutions where either you're not in control either. So that's something we've seen a lot, and some of the value I think we've been able to provide to care providers today.
One of the things that we stick to at the Care Leaders Network certainly is if it's not a core competency, we work out how to automate it, delegate it, or outsource
Yep.
it. It's just the way that we operate because we know what we're good at. We also know that we're not particularly good at, and I guess that's a judgment call for different organisations to make themselves. But for somebody that's a massive fan of getting rid of stuff and getting experts in to fix particular problems, I'm certainly an advocate for that. And just to wrap things up, you mentioned, I think, earlier that people call you quite a lot of the time and just ask you questions just to say we're maybe in a bit of a pickle, we're stuck with this particular set of circumstances and things. You're happy to take those calls and to try and help people navigate the set of circumstances as well.
Absolutely, yeah. We do a lot of work just demystifying what the Home Office does, making the terminology and language of immigration simpler, producing useful resources for all stakeholders in this ecosystem to better come to grips with all of these matters. And so you can go over to the website, you can see all of our latest blogs and guides. You can go and see our calculators and quizzes. We are helping you demystify this process of sponsorship, whether it's right for you, how to start tackling the process. And so that's something that we do a lot of. I do think that what we've seen with the CLN network is that providers are very forward thinking. They're very willing to embrace technological solutions to these problems. And even just in the last 2-3 years, I've seen a real trend in the amount of dialogue that happens around care companies seeking to migrate to the best-in-class systems to set themselves up even from the beginning well for success. And so, technology is obviously impacting every single facet of our world. And it's an inevitable transition, right? We're never going to move backwards on these things. And so embracing that and making sure that you are setting yourself up well for success is something I think that it's really, really important for care leaders to do to make sure that their organizations continue to evolve with the times.
Here's to that. Can we grab the website just as a final point for people? Obviously, you've got quite a lot of really useful resources on there. I've read a couple of blogs; they're fantastic. Give us the website just to wrap things up.
Yeah, sure. So just head over to www.getborderless.co.uk and you're going to find, if you head over to the resources section, you're going to see lots of guides, webinars, events, blogs. We're really, really out there, so come talk to us at any point in time. It's really easy to get in touch with the team. And even if you just have a question on something, we're very happy to help on that.
Superb. Matt Bond, thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated. It's been great talking to you about all things sponsorship.
Thanks, Simon. It's been great to be here.
And there we go.